Good morning and afternoon, everyone, and happy Earth Day. I'm so glad you could join us today. My name is Candace Williams, and I am the Director of Major Gifts here at NatureServe. It's a pleasure to welcome you all. Earth Day is always a meaningful moment for us at NatureServe. It's a chance to reflect on the incredible diversity of life around us, and also to recognize the importance of having the right information to protect it. That's really at the heart of everything we do. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping notes. We'll answer questions at the end of today's presentation. However, you can submit questions at any time using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And I'll be moderating those questions and sharing as many as we can. Today's webinar is also being recorded. All of the webinar registrants will receive a copy of the recording in a few days. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Josh Daskin. Josh is the Chief Scientist at NatureServe, where he leads strategy for our science and its application to conservation with our agency, NGO, academic, and corporate partners. He has published research spanning science of animal movement, habitat connectivity, wildfire, large mammal, amphibian ecology, and coastal environmental science and public health. Josh holds a BS in biology and environmental studies from Brandeis University, a Master of Science in zoology from James Cook University in Australia, and a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Princeton University. Josh, thank you for being here today. I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Candace, and good afternoon and good morning to those of you out west. Thank you for giving us a little bit of your time today, and happy Earth Day. It is a pleasure to be able to speak to you a little bit about all the things NatureServe is doing. And just as a little bit of introduction of what we're going to cover today, I'm going to give a little bit of introduction to what NatureServe is and how we work for those that NatureServe may be new to. Then we're going to spend most of the talk about landscape conservation and why landscapes matter for biodiversity. How NatureServe helps protect them, and then we'll wrap up with just a little bit about how you all can help. So in some sense, NatureServe's work is simple. We aim to apply science and data to guide biodiversity conservation, its stewardship, its protection, its restoration. However, there's immense complexity to biodiversity. We track over 100,000 species and ecosystems. And we aim to make sense of that complexity so that others can make decisions that benefit it. If you know us, you will know that we have three key questions that we try to answer. What is it, where is it, and how is it doing? What is it refers to the taxonomy, the naming, the relationships between species. And we hold that information for over 100,000 species and ecosystems in the US and Canada. Where is it refers to the mapped locations of those elements of biodiversity, the species and ecosystems that we hold in our databases. It tells us where to find these species, where it needs to be protected, and where might be at risk. How is it doing is that question that's so crucial to what we spend our limited time and treasure in the conservation world on, which species and ecosystems are at risk. Much of what we do is enabled by our network of 60 natural heritage programs and Canadian data centers in the US and Canada. This is a group of over 1,000 field biologists in state and tribal government, in academia, and in a few nonprofits. Together, they have collected the over 1.5 million mapped locations comprising our expert-backed foundational data on the geospatial the locations of where Canadian and US biodiversity exists. So you can see a small piece of that data set here, and our work stretches back over 50 years. We're possibly best known for our G1 to G5 global conservation status rankings, which right now are stewarded by our lead biologist, Amanda Eberly, and lead zoologist, Tara Cornelisi, as well as our expert databasing staff. These are freely available with tremendous documentation for each species and ecosystem for tens of thousands of species. And the network's biologists construct similar rankings for subnational, state, or territorial or provincial ranks. Species in the kind of G5 and G4 realm on the left are those that are more secure. Species in the G1 and G2 realm are those that are at greatest risk. And again, you can find these on our Explorer and Explorer Pro platforms, which are freely available online. We also produce synthesis data based on the information that we get from our network, and that includes species habitat models like the one for the frosted flatwood salamander shown on the left here, kept primarily by Max Tarjan and David Buckland. And these give us predictions for where to find species in places that haven't been surveyed on the ground, but where the habitat is likely compatible, likely amenable to the species being found. We have a very similar project mapping the location of ecosystems, and based on the National Vegetation Classification, which our ecologist Don Faber-Langendoen has pioneered over many years working for NatureServe. This map on the right here shows a particular formation of the Mojave and Sonoran deserts, a type of desert scrub, and where it's found in the southwestern US and into Mexico. Our newest tool, which you may have heard about, is Insight by NatureServe. This was put together by a whole host of NatureServe staff over the last year and a half, but a few folks deserve a special mention: Chris Tracy, Sarah DeCaro, Regan Smythe, Laurie Scott, and Megan Espy in particular. And this is a tool we're really excited about. It is a custom tool where users can give us a polygon or an area of interest, and we will map for them the species extinction risk, the ecosystem risk, and the habitat quality, the ecosystem condition for that area that they're maybe planning a new conservation easement in, maybe a restoration project, maybe a new development, and they want to mitigate biodiversity risk. And we'll compare that site level score with the dial that you see to the same for the state or national scale. So this is a new way of getting our information out there for conservation action, and we are very excited to make that available. That's one example of why we do all of the data curation and data stewardship that we do. It's not just to hold it and publish the data. Our work influences conservation actions daily, from globally leading conservation nonprofits to the public agencies that steward our federal lands, state lands, as well, and corporate partners who are documenting, minimizing, and reversing impacts to biodiversity based on that what is it, where is it, and how is it doing information. Some of the impact that we target is for individual at-risk species. So for example, our NatureServe habitat models have helped the National Parks Conservation Association determine where in South Texas around the Big Thicket National Preserve the red-cockaded woodpecker, a federally threatened species, might best be reintroduced. This is a species that was formerly listed as endangered and has seen some recovery as the quality of its longleaf pine habitat across the Southeast has been restored through plantings and prescribed fire. So we love this kind of work when our data can be tied directly to a potential habitat or species management action on the ground. I'll give you one other species level example from the sort of fantastically named golden sedge, which is the species here on the left. And this is a species that was listed as endangered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service under the Endangered Species Act 25 years ago in 2002. At the time, the species was only known from the state of North Carolina, a North Carolina endemic. It is threatened by fire suppression, so it lives in fire-maintained habitats, conversion of its very limited habitat for development, the construction of roads and rights-of-way, the use of herbicides in these areas to manage roadsides, as well as some forms of agriculture and development. Sometimes it's just the NatureServe data and our network partners' data that can actually move the needle on conservation, and that's the case here, which is really neat. The first of 5 recovery criteria that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service names for this species to be delisted is that there have to be at least 10 known good condition locations where this species is found. There were not that many in North Carolina, But in recent years, our NatureServe network partner in the state of Florida, the Florida Natural Areas Inventory, actually surveyed for this species and found it in multiple protected areas and on private lands. Since then, it's also been found in the state of South Carolina. So we're moving along towards that pathway of 10 good condition locations, one of the necessary criteria for removing the species from the Endangered Species Act list. The impacts of our work, though, are not limited to individual species. Our scientists are really adept at synthesizing information for conservation decisions at the scale of whole landscapes. This is critical and actually very popular way to do conservation program design and action. So I'm going to spend most of the rest of this morning and afternoon talking about landscapes and how we work at these larger scales. So firstly, what exactly do I mean by landscape conservation? In the simplest sense, it's about physical scale. So this is a diagram from a paper that was published in Science by some of the world's leaders on habitat connectivity and landscape conservation last year. And you can see we're not really talking about the really local scale, like from the stream to the forest within a small particular park. But we're also not talking about the really big multi-state conservation, like, for instance, global migratory pathways. This is something intermediate, connecting patches of habitat that are maybe separated by a town, maybe separated by some other type of development or agriculture, and that are really critical to maintaining the processes for maintenance and restoration of biodiversity. A group called the Network for Landscape Conservation, which is a collaborative of many dozens of organizations and partnerships in which NatureServe is a recent new member of, defines landscape conservation in three ways. It is by that scale, and they think about it as needing to be at a scale that is encompassing of biodiversity, of the functions that ecosystems provide. So that could be floodplain management or fire protection or carbon storage, and climate resilience, allowing things to respond to disturbances as climate change and other disturbances progress. Secondly, landscape conservation is actually about a shift in perspective in how we think about the science and the practice of conservation. It's not really enough and not sufficient to think only about strict protected areas where we build a fence, actual or metaphorical, around a park. We have to be considering the whole suite of ways that land and water is used. So landscape conservation is about bringing in the perspective of working lands, agricultural areas, maybe timber, as well as places of cultural and historical significance, rural communities. All of these are part of the solution, and they tend to depend on each other. Finally, landscape conservation is about process. Because we're talking about crossing jurisdictional boundaries, property boundaries, thematic boundaries, it requires collaborative partnerships with long-term participation by all relevant types of stakeholders. That's NGOs, that's agencies, some cases private landowners themselves. The scientific understanding of the importance of landscapes stretches back many decades, at least, to a classic experiment by none other than E.O. Wilson and his then PhD student, Daniel Simberloff. In the 1960s, they found that among mangrove islands in Florida, and this picture shows E.O. Wilson next to one of those islands, the larger islands and those that were closer to the mainland of the state of Florida had more species on them. In the decades since, that understanding has evolved and expanded to where we think about continental conservation biology, not only oceanic islands, but islands of habitat in a sea of development or a sea of disturbance. This famous experiment, as well as many others since then, including the famous Biological Dynamics of Forest Fragments project in rainforests of Brazil that experimentally fragmented habitats, show tremendous evidence that larger and better connected patches are key to maintaining species populations. So this slightly complicated graph that I'll walk you through here comes from a review of many studies of habitat connectivity and landscape connectivity. And you can see that all of these values of biodiversity, movement of species, the abundance of individual species, the ability of species to persist, the number of species in a patch, even things like pollination. These things work less well. That's why they're to the left of that zero in areas that are more isolated, these islands of habitat. So it's really critical to be thinking about the scale of landscapes if we want all of these functions that support biodiversity to be conserved. We can look at certain species operating at landscape scales. A great example is pronghorn, the fastest terrestrial animal in the United States and Canada. It migrated the sublet population of this species found in western Wyoming migrates about 200 miles a year. It's the longest terrestrial migration in the US. And along the way, they cross numerous property boundaries, habitat types, fences, roads, development, ranches. Imagine the complexity of working to conserve all the necessary parts of the pathway of this species migration, given the ecological and the social dynamics that have to be worked through. And that's just one species. I'll give you one other example. This touches aquatic species as well, and Gulf sturgeon are an exemplary case. They are wired to move long distances from their feeding grounds in the Gulf of Mexico upstream into 6 southeastern rivers, all of which are dependent on landscape scale management, for example, to avoid runoff of excessive pollution from many different landowners, many different land uses in the river's watersheds. The species is hypersensitive to pollution, to dams, to other disturbances in its aquatic environment. I've already alluded to it, but managing landscapes and the science of landscape conservation is also about the processes that are key to biodiversity. So on the left, you see an expansive fire scar on a floodplain ecosystem. There are many fire-maintained ecosystems in the US and Canada, and it's much easier to manage both wildfires, natural fires, and prescribed burns that managers do to simulate the historical conditions when you have a connected, conserved landscape. If it's pockmarked with development, it's much harder to protect people and property. Flooding, again, is another great example of landscape function. This is a map of Arcadia, Florida, in the center of the state during Hurricane Ian a couple of years ago. And the Peace River you see meandering north to south, flooded over its banks into the town and over a major roadway, State Route 70. This was a big problem for the city, a big problem for moving people and goods for a couple of weeks at a time. And so managing with landscape processes in mind gives us the opportunity to protect aquatic species, but also, again, the things that people hold dear. So this is potentially a win-win. Why landscapes for NatureServe? Well, it fits us quite well. We work at regional to national scale, and we have that network of natural heritage programs across the US and Canada. Our ecology and spatial analysis teams made this map thanks to Chris Tracy, Patrick McIntyre, Dawn Faber-Langendoon, Kristen Snow, and Regan Smythe. You can visit that map and see this tremendously detailed work mapping US ecosystems if you follow that QR code, and I think we're putting a link in the chat as well. The final why on landscapes is maybe my favorite one in some ways. It produces a sense of wonder among people. And that's a fine reason to think about working on planning well for conservation and for inevitable development on Earth Day. Landscape conservation in the US has grown tremendously in the last 2 years on the back of all of these reasons to think hard and work hard on it. In new work that we are just about to submit for publication, I've worked with colleagues at Virginia Tech, Nicole Gorman and Brett Jesmer, to document the habitat connectivity, inherently landscape scale, policies in government and NGO-led projects across the US. And you can see there's been tremendous growth as the opportunity that landscape conservation presents for biodiversity, for recreation, for tourism, for rural economies even, becomes mainstreamed. This work touches almost all states. The Midwest and Southeast are maybe primed to go next, although even those areas have some great examples. One place to start talking about how NatureServe works specifically on landscape conservation is with our one tool that actually has the word landscape in it, our landscape condition model. This was first published in 2017, and you can see a map of it here where the more bluish green areas are in really great condition, and the yellower and especially the browner areas are more degraded. You can think of this as based on land cover. So like what exactly is in each pixel? Is it a farm? Is it a forest? Is it a grassland? Is it a city? So that defines part of the condition. But because we're talking about landscape condition here, it really the quality of habitat in each pixel depends on what's around it. And so we have built an algorithm where the impacts of surrounding habitat types, again, all of those that I named before, as well as infrastructure like roads or power plants, actually bleeds into a given pixel. Different kinds of disturbances have stronger or weaker effects and bleed further or not as far into the landscape. You might see some correlation, some relationship between this map and the previous one of where landscape conservation actions are being taken. There's less in the areas that are more fragmented. Again, parts of the Midwest, parts of the most dense corridors of the Northeast, and parts of the Southeast. NatureServe has also been in conversation with a number of federal and state agency staff and their partners about an exciting possible new analysis using that landscape condition model to assess what types of landscapes, what quality of landscapes have seen new development and potentially habitat loss in the last decade. If it's funded this fall, we will be looking at the 17 U.S. Sentinel landscapes. These are areas shown on this map and that are designated by the Department of War as focal points for landscape scale partnerships between federal, state, local, and nonprofit and private landowners to find military conservation win-wins around key military installations, training, or bases. These are really innovative, very neat partnerships that find that nexus between what the military work requires and what conservation of biodiversity requires. So think about ambient noise, think about night light. Lots of species are sensitive to losing the dark skies, and pilots really like to fly in dark skies as well. Wildfire risk can disturb both species, ecosystems, and military training. And so by assessing the proportion of new development that was in either of those high or low condition areas on the landscape condition model map, we would determine what proportion of, or to what extent, I should say, each of these sentinel landscapes is threatened by urban densification, the packing of people into an existing city, urban sprawl, the kind of spreading out of the boundaries of those cities or suburban areas, or leapfrog development, the construction of new infrastructure, new homes, new cities, far from the existing ones. That's important because each of those types of development requires different conservation responses, whether it's county level planning or federally financed conservation easements or something else. We're also looking to fund an update to the landscape condition model that would include new land cover and effect distances, higher resolution, and the incorporation of new types of disturbances like the burgeoning solar power construction that's happening in the US, pipelines, and improved representation of working timber forests and open water. NatureServe is also engaging in landscape conservation in the process sense. Next week, I have the pleasure of speaking at the annual meeting of the Southeast Regional Partnership for Planning and Sustainability. This meeting in North Carolina is a collaborative of 6 Southeast states and several federal agencies, again, working at that nexus of military and conservation missions. The Department of War stewards a tremendous amount of land that is often in excellent condition and chock full of rare species. And the discussion at this meeting will include how to conserve those things like dark skies and open spaces while limiting development to compatible areas for both biodiversity and national security. In a separate line of work led by ecologist and director of corporate partnerships, Ricky White, we are partnering with several major forestry companies and the Sustainable Forestry Initiative to share information on recognizable habitats within landscapes where paper and pulp wood is harvested for generation of those products, paper and pulp. By putting this information into the hands of foresters and loggers, we are improving the practices used to meet SFI's forest certification standards, which touch hundreds of millions of acres across the US and Canada. We first pioneered this work in North Carolina, and this map on the right shows a portion of eastern North Carolina with the circle representing the area from which a particular mill sources wood for paper and pulp. You can see a couple of the species, including gopher frog and pondberry, which we considered in deciding which umbrella habitats do foresters really need to know about if they're going to plan their harvests correctly or plan their harvests best to mitigate potential damage to biodiversity in the process of doing their forestry work. One of those habitat types that we highlighted is shown at the top left here. It's a cypress dome. These are really cool swamps that are found in the southeast, and they're particularly useful for us in this project because their circular nature makes them easy to map. So to ensure that the habitats that we are sharing to foresters actually describe and capture a sizable portion of rare species habitats, our lead biodiversity data scientist, Grace DeCecco, analyzed the portion of rare species habitats from mapped data from our network biologists onto these cypress domes. So the horizontal here says percent mapped areas within these ecosystems. This just shows for areas where we know these species exist, what proportion of that mapped area overlaps this habitat. And for the 4 species I'm showing you here, the news is good. We've identified a habitat, Carolina bays, which are capturing 50%, 70%, in some cases even 100% of the mapped locations for these rare species. We repeated this work in Pennsylvania recently, in the Northern Appalachians, around another mill. In Pennsylvania, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative's certification standards cover 2.5 million acres of forests. So there's tremendous scope for the work that NatureServe is doing to improve certification standards and practices. We're providing the template for working lands conservation and hoping to expand this work nationwide and beyond. Just about 3 weeks ago, the first logger training, in which several dozen loggers were made aware of this work and how to use it, took place at this mill in Pennsylvania, something that we're really proud of. To this point, I've mostly talked about our own data sets and how we apply them. In some cases, NatureServe's data really serve as the foundational information that others modify to create biodiversity data products that have been just incredibly influential in US and Canadian conservation. And this is one example. What I'm showing you here is the Nature Conservancy's Resilient and Connected Network. The blues and greens show different combinations of areas that are highly important for biodiversity based on NatureServe's data, as well as for habitat connectivity and climate resilience. This was put together by Mark Anderson at the Nature Conservancy and hundreds of collaborating scientists. But NatureServe data serve as the underlying foundation of the biodiversity component here. This map is now foundational to landscape conservation work across the United States, and it draws on 60+ detailed eco-regional assessments that NatureServe completed over past years. It's used by over 500 land trusts and 1,000 monthly users to prioritize and justify conservation actions across the country. We ourselves use related data, in particular in a recent project led by Hannah Caesar and Chris Tracy with the National Parks Conservation Association. This nonprofit came to us looking for support in their campaigns to highlight and prioritize the importance of not just the national parks themselves, but the larger landscapes that those parks are part of, and that rely on those areas as buffers for the biodiversity within our parks. As we all know, flora and fauna don't stop at political boundaries, so it's really critical to consider that larger landscape conservation effort. We used NatureServe's map of biodiversity importance, which you can find freely available online. It's a set of stacked species habitat models. It shows you where the most rare species are likely to be found, as well as those Nature Conservancy derived data sets on climate resilience and habitat connectivity for each of a set of national parks landscapes shown in green. To give you one example of what these analyses looked like and how we customized these analyses for local context in each landscape, we can zoom in to this little red box in Georgia around the Ocmulgee and Altamaha rivers, where Hannah and Chris used our 3 standard layers, the map of biodiversity importance, which is shown zoomed in on the left here, but also summarized data from Colorado State University on stream flow alteration, which is critical to aquatic biodiversity in this region. So we are working to really customize the data that we provide, not only from our standards, but also from available top quality information that helps our partners do the conservation planning they come to us looking to improve. Finally, we are also working directly with the Park Service itself in the Southeast to help define management strategies for 46 National Park Service units, including, for example, Great Smoky Mountains National Park, the most visited national park in the country. This work is led by our Director of Ecology, Patrick McIntyre, and along with Carl Nordman, one of our ecologists. And they are working to identify areas of unfragmented natural habitat that we call natural landscape blocks, and to measure the resilience of each of those to future disturbance. We're also pulling lists from our leading database of rare species and ecosystems and those mapped locations of these biodiversity elements to help the Park Service plan which natural landscape blocks, which parts of their parks, their national monuments, their national preserves are likely to have which species. We're even identifying a few examples of species that maybe weren't quite yet known to park managers. One particular example is a sedge, Fimbrostylus brevigata, which we identified from Little Canyon River National Preserve, shown here in the beautiful fall foliage photo in Alabama, which we think is likely a new addition to the park's flora list. We're then going to finish that project up by writing recommended resilience and management strategies for a set of these parks to help plan the future of our public lands. So that takes us to the end of today's talk, and just a few words of summary. I really hope this whirlwind tour of some of the ongoing science and partnerships that NatureServe is fortunate to hold and work on has left you curious about the world and eager to get outside for part of this Earth Day. We at NatureServe are working hard to protect the places that you really love and call home. This is also, of course, enabled by the support of many contributors, including donors like you. For over 50 years, the NatureServe Network has been supporting effective stewardship of the nation's natural resources. We are part and parcel to hundreds of Endangered Species Act listing decisions, nearly all the state wildlife action plans, which help prioritize where conservation resources are steered, national forests, national parks, and nonprofit actions as well. I think with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Candace and look forward to hearing any questions folks have in a couple of minutes.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh. That was incredibly insightful. If today's presentation resonated with you, I'd like to take a moment to invite you to support NatureServe's work. Everything you heard today, whether it's tracking species, understanding habitat change, or guiding conservation decisions, depends on having reliable, up-to-date biodiversity data. Support from donors like you helps ensure that this information stays current and accessible to the people making critical decisions about land use, conservation, and resource management. If you're interested in supporting this work, please scan the QR code or visit our website to donate today. Another simple way to stay engaged is by staying connected with us. You can follow NatureServe on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, or X to see how this science is being applied every day, from local conservation efforts to large-scale planning across North America. Okay, now I'd love to turn to your questions. Thank you, everyone who's already submitted them. If you would like, there's still an opportunity to submit your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I'll start with a few that have come in, and then we'll get through as many as we can. If we don't get to your question today, we will follow up with you after the webinar. Okay, Josh, a question from an attendee. Is there a role for citizen scientists to contribute or participate in this work?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. And if you are a citizen scientist and you are already logging information in an app like iNaturalist or eBird, you are already contributing to our work and we appreciate it. The conservation status ranks that I mentioned early in the talk, those G1 to G5 ranks, actually do use a portion of the iNaturalist observations when our biologists go and rank species. Our species habitat models also draw on a subset of citizen science records, and many of our network programs have also developed methods for using iNaturalist records in similar work and in things like identifying progressing invasions of invasive species or other more local work. So absolutely, the work that citizen scientists put in does help us.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Okay, another question. This landscape level work seems to naturally bring in a lot of different partners. How are those partnerships helping this move forward? And what's next for landscape conservation at NatureServe?
Thank you. That's a great question. And the first part, how are partnerships moving landscape conservation forward, is a tremendous one. It's the only way that landscape conservation moves forward because of some of what I mentioned about the scale. You're dealing inherently with multiple landowners, whether it's multiple state and federal agencies, could be private timberlands or ranches, could be areas slated for development. So inherently, landscape conservation is about partnerships. Some of those are really formalized, like the Southeast Regional Partnership for Planning and Sustainability that I mentioned I'll be at next week. Some of them are much more informal and loose and develop in communities. So I would encourage you to understand where landscape conservation is happening around wherever you're calling in from today. Land trusts are usually quite closely involved in these kinds of efforts. And your local natural heritage program will also very likely know quite a bit about them.
Great, thank you. Let's see. We have a couple of questions about private landowners. So I'm going to try to combine these.
Sure.
Okay, just generally speaking, can you talk a little bit more about how we might work with private landowners?
Yeah. So I think the first thing I would say is that NatureServe sits in a role where we're really first and foremost data stewards, data aggregators, data analysts, data providers. And most of our data, or a lot of our data, at least I should say, comes from the natural heritage programs, many of which are in state government. And as a function of that, a lot of our data is skewed towards public lands. That's where agencies tend to work. That's where access is best. And really, actually, worldwide, we have the best information about biodiversity on public lands. That's just where biologists tend to work. There has been an increasing realization that private lands are, of course, also often stewarding great biodiversity importance. And so some of our work, like species habitat modeling, those predictive maps of where we might expect to find rare species, can point us to where should we maybe look to make some friends with private landowners. And I say we, not necessarily NatureServe, but we as the conservation community, we as actors interested in stewarding biodiversity. So some of our emerging work and proposals that we're putting in now are actually to help state and federal agencies use our habitat models to identify either neighboring agencies or neighboring private landowners where species of conservation interest are likely to be found, and conservation resources like restoration dollars or habitat management money might actually go and help those private landowners. So again, that's not really necessarily work that NatureServe does itself, but we absolutely inform it. And there's tremendous conservation capacity on private lands through programs like the Natural Resources Conservation Service, through other easements, technical assistance programs, and we're very proud to help steer that work.
Okay, our next question. You have so much data, but how do you handle the lack of data, particularly types of lands that might be prone to it as you model what areas are important for biodiversity? Now, the part two to this question, are there things you try to do to catch places that have conservation value but are not typically monitored?
Yeah, so some of this again touches on a little bit of what I mentioned with private lands. And there are inherently gaps in where that million and a half, those million and a half mapped locations have been collected. We tend to work on public lands, we tend to work on protected lands. And so, yes, there are absolutely gaps of multiple types: geographic, land ownership, taxonomic in terms of which types of species receive attention. So vertebrates perhaps over invertebrates, vascular plants over non-vascular plants and fungi historically. And so all of those gaps have, all those types of gaps have different types of ways of dealing with them. Again, one would be species habitat models. If you're not familiar with that modeling methodology, essentially we're taking the mapped locations of the species and saying what type of habitat is there, what characterizes the habitat where the species lives, and then using models or maps of where that habitat exists to extrapolate and predict, okay, we haven't been on this property, we may never be on this property, we may never be in this county, but which species do we expect to find there? That type of work has grown tremendously at NatureServe in the last several years and underlies our map of biodiversity importance. In terms of taxonomy, actually, taxonomic gaps, NatureServe and our natural heritage programs play a relatively unique role as an organization that tends to speak up for some of the less well-known species or less well-appreciated species. We absolutely focus some of our work on invertebrates. We absolutely work on some of our non-vascular plants and fungi. So I think our biologists are among those in the US who are most focused on trying to fill those taxonomic gaps.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is from someone in Portugal. So they say, I am in Portugal and here most of the land is privately owned, 97%. Are you developing tools that work under these contexts, for example, emergent markets for biodiversity?
Yeah, great question. I guess firstly, I'll just say and reiterate, like the data sets that we hold are US and Canada. And so we're not directly working much on European landscapes. However, the science that we develop, some of the concepts and some of the types of tools could be applied to conservation solutions that are relevant in other places. At the biggest, broadest, most zoomed out scale, our participation as scientists in landscape cooperatives, like I've mentioned today, as well as in species level cooperatives, helps set the stage for bringing science into decision making anywhere. Are we working on biodiversity credit markets, carbon markets? I would say we're just starting to. One of our natural heritage programs in Colorado is part of a biodiversity credits pilot. And that is a realm of conservation that is really just emerging. So we're hyper interested in how our data can interface with economic values that are aligned with biodiversity conservation or ecosystem services conservation. We are not working tremendously in the intersection of ecology and economics in terms of our own science at the minute.
Okay, another question. Any recommendations or requests for scientists who work not at the full scale that you do to help feed into your work?
I think I understand that question, Candice. If you help me, if you agree, do you think it's about how other scientists can help NatureServe with our science?
Mhm.
Yeah, so there are a few ways. If you're in a natural heritage program, if you're one of those 1,000 biologists, you're already doing it, and we thank you. If you are not in the natural heritage programs, we sometimes partner with expert scientists on completing conservation status assessments. I believe Tara, our zoologist, has been speaking recently with somebody who's interested in completing some beetle assessments in the southeast. And that kind of thing happens sometimes when there might be a particular local policy relevance of making sure that our conservation status assessments are up to date or as up to date as possible. We also do sometimes partner with academic researchers, if that's who you are, on questions of particular conceptual science importance or conservation syntheses. So we're working right now with a group at University of Tennessee who's using that ecosystems map I showed to assess which ecosystems in the United States are better or worse protected. So if you have ideas, we're happy to hear from you and think about whether our data might be able to help move your own science forward and whether it might help advance our priorities. Thank you.
Great. Okay, Josh, last question as we wrap this up. Can you tell us what we can look forward to? What are you most excited about in the next year?
Yeah, we have a lot going on. I would say hopefully the continued growth of the forestry work that I mentioned will be expanding. We've done it, as I said, at the site scale, the kind of the woodshed, if you will, for individual mills in North Carolina and Pennsylvania, and we'll be expanding it to the state of Mississippi next. By doing it at the whole state scale, we'll be able to make the information on rare species locations and really the habitats where they're likely to be found available to a whole suite of timber and paper and pulp producers. And then I'm also really excited about work we're just starting and piloting to use some kind of simple, actually, remote sensing tools, satellite-derived information to map land cover changes and potential habitat loss within the mapped polygons that our natural heritage programs have supplied over the years. So which species, which ecosystems, which states, which counties are perhaps experiencing the highest rates of land cover change, and how can we incorporate those trends, those threats into our conservation status assessments so that we continue to provide the most up-to-date, most meaningful, most crucial information to all of our partners in government, in NGOs, in private corporations, private landowners as well, to make the best biodiversity decisions possible.
Okay, great. That's all of our questions for today. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to Josh. I thank you all again for spending part of your Earth Day with us. We truly appreciate your time, your interest, and your commitment to protecting biodiversity. We'll follow up with a recording of today's webinar, and we hope to stay connected. Have a wonderful rest of your day and happy Earth Day.